gonna look twice at you. Until I see the Christ in you. I'm gonna look twice at you. Until I see the Christ in you. When I'm looking through the eyes of love. 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 I'm gonna look twice at you. Until I see the Christ in you. I'm gonna look twice at you. Until I see the Christ in you. When I'm looking through the eyes of love. 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 Gonna look twice at you. Until I see the Christ in you. One more time. I'm gonna look twice at you. Until I see the Christ in you. Today we're talking about Jesus as a prophet. Jesus' political message, it could be. Jesus' message that challenged the structures of his day. A prophet, it's a hard topic because it makes us uncomfortable. Because when we hear Jesus challenge the structures of his day, it also challenges the structures of our day. And I'm glad Reverend Dr. Irie Session is with us today to help us, because some people would consider Irie a prophet. Yeah, because our text today, the first one we read from chapter 15, Jesus talks about it's not what you put into your mouth that defiles you, but it's what comes out. And it's so in the day and age Jesus had, some scholars have written about this, that there was a purity system kind of set up, where Jerusalem was at the center of purity, and then the farther you go out and the farther you go away from the chosen people, the people of God, the more unclean you got just by default. So if you were to come from Rome and move to Jerusalem, many of the Jewish people would not associate with you because you were unclean. Now, if you were a Jew who had grown up in Rome and you come back to Jerusalem, you might be a little bit better, a little bit higher on the ladder. It's kind of like And it's kind of like how, even in Dallas, we talk about this. We use this kind of language sometimes. We talk about people who live in Highland Park. We'll say, oh, you live in East Dallas. Oh, that's tough. And you're like, wait a minute. And then, but people in East Dallas say, well, hey, I don't live in South Dallas. Mm-hmm. And, you know, there's this there's this sense of hierarchy to it of, you know, how, and, you know, I found, you know, I'm not a native Dallasite, but I even find it irritates me when people say, oh, I'm from Dallas, I live in Plano. I'm like, you're not from Dallas. You're from Plano. You know, whatever. You know, but that's kind of a really simple example of this kind of system, this pattern of behavior that had built up, so that even if you didn't wash your hands before you ate, you were unclean. You were not to be messed with. You're not to be touched. And of course, the people who probably didn't have the best access to water and to wash their hands were the poor, and were people who had diseases and were the outcasts on the edges of society. So it was a way of sorting out people and sorting out the kind of structures. So, I mean, that's kind of my perspective on it. But, you know, it seems to me that one of the challenges that the text and Jesus does as a prophet, and as you mentioned, was like, he challenges our idea of an individual morality, that it's all just about if we do everything right, if as individuals, if we just follow the Ten Commandments, we're good. But Jesus doesn't seem to leave it there. He doesn't let us stay there. So what's your perspective? What does it mean that Jesus is a prophet to you?
I think the gentleman in the clip, in the first clip, really nailed it and nailed everything I was going to say. But it means that Jesus he brought critique to bear on the political system, on the religious system, on the status quo. Jesus did not want to keep people and keep business as usual. One of the things that Walter Brueggemann talks about, and he has this great book called The Prophetic Imagination. He talks about the prophet engaging in something called complex seeing, S-E-E-I-N-G. And what that means is that the person who is prophetic, and again, we have to really deconstruct this word prophetic, because I think it has gotten a lot of bad press. Because when we speak, and I think when we're speaking of prophetic, we're not speaking of necessarily, you know, telling the future, even though there's an element in sort of being able to see the future, at least a righteous, just future. But that is not what we're talking about when we use the term prophetic. We're talking about really bringing God's justice to bear on whatever the situation is. And so this idea of the prophet engaging in complex seeing, the prophetic person sees situations in a way that others do not see it. For example, when God sent Moses to rescue the children out of Egyptian bondage, God saw, and Moses saw, more than just the Israelites making brick from straw. What God saw and what God helped Moses to see was an unjust economic system that benefited at the expense of the poor and the marginalized. And Pharaoh was living as if that system was okay, and that system was the way things ought to be. But when Moses came, Moses, by taking the children out of Israel, by confronting Pharaoh, overthrew that system. And so that is what Jesus did. Jesus came to dismantle the system of oppression of the Roman government. That was one of the major things to say, this is not the kingdom. The kingdom looks something different. And so that is, and boy, can we not apply that to 21st century America, a 21st century world. And truth is, we don't want to change. We don't want to be confronted with our bigotry, with our prejudice, and we've all got it, all of us. We don't want to be confronted with those things. We want to see Jesus as this meek, mild, gentle figure who went around doing good and didn't upset anybody. But you see, that doesn't get people killed.
Right.
And I think that's one of the reasons. And I think, Deborah, too, some people, they really don't get it. I think that I don't think they're being dishonest. I think they really don't get it. They don't get the deeper theological implications of Jesus' ministry. They do a cursory reading. They don't really get deep into those, tough issues. I want to say something. You were talking, it's so interesting. You were talking about, people in, Highland Park, oh, you live in South Dallas, and this hierarchy thing. Mm-hmm. Do you know, I even noticed that working with the women that I work with. There is this sense of, and this is what our society has done to people, even, people on the margins. There's this hierarchy. And they come often, the women that have been on the street prostitutes, and then the ones that have been high-end escorts. The high-end escorts see themselves, at least until we get done with them, see themselves sort of superior. Well, I didn't do that. Mm-hmm. I wasn't on the street, or I didn't have sex for drugs. And even among that population, there is this hierarchical setting that there's somebody lower than me that makes me feel superior.
That connected back to me just mentally of just, we'll celebrate in a couple weeks. We'll do, Maundy Thursday. We practice on Thursday. We remember the Passover meal that Jesus had with his disciples. And one of the things Jesus did that was so shocking to them was he got down on his knees and took a basin of water and a towel and began to clean his disciples' feet. I mean, if there was anybody who deserved some hierarchy,
that's right,
it would have been Jesus, right?
Sure.
But he even reversed that sense of hierarchy. Mm-hmm. If you want to lead, you must serve. Yes. So that's challenging, though.
And that's a political statement that he was making. Even when Jesus knelt, Jesus, the Son of God, knelt and washed dirty, stank disciples' feet. He was making a political statement saying that although politically, although I am the Son of God, even I, and if I do it, certainly the rest of you need to be doing it. And so he was sort of subtle in some instances in his approach, but even those kinds of things can be seen as an affront to a political system that was about superiority, that was about hierarchy, that was about succeeding with their feet on the necks of those who could not help themselves. I think the inclusivity piece is important. I also think that along with, it's one thing to be inclusive, but then, and it's another thing to, once you've been inclusive, to see those who are included as equal. We can invite people in. We can invite people to come and join us, but do they have the same voice as we do when we come to the table? Do we even with them being included, do we still have this sense that, but my thinking is really better than yours? Or I'm right and you're wrong, but you can join me. But you don't have an equal stake or an equal voice at the table. So it's inclusivity, I think, and acceptance. Even if we don't agree, accept another person's right to be and to think and to express themselves in the way that they know how, you know. And that's one of the things I think that make the ministry that I serve so effective, is because, but it's also difficult for the women coming because they expect judgment. They expect, they don't expect the love that they receive, and they don't know often how to even embrace that acceptance and that non-judgmental attitude that we have toward them. Because they're included, but they're also accepted. They're also listened to. They're also valued. We also consult them. You know, we don't just unilaterally make decisions for them that affect them. We involve them in that discussion process. And so, to me, that's what community is about. It's about everybody having a voice.
Thanks for checking us out at tabledallas.org. We're so glad you joined us for this conversation, which is a tough conversation about the prophetic ministry of Jesus and how that challenges not just our lives, but our societies as well. So if you have questions or you have other things you'd like to add to the conversation, shoot me an email, use the contact form here on this website, or even check us out on Facebook. We'd be happy to receive those and share in this conversation together. Or check us out. We'll be here next week talking about Jesus as a healer, and that's 9:30 a.m. every Sunday morning right here at the table at 629 North Peak Street. Or check us out for more information on the website at tabledallas.org. See you next time. Bye.